Hello, everybody. Good morning. So welcome, everybody, for coming to our webinar, our class, which is the CE online class for HRCI and SHRM. And the topic is the pandemic is over, what now? Must-dos of summer 2021 for business owners. So 新冠肺炎疫情结束了，现在应该做什么？雇主2021夏季必做之事。So my name is Angel. Welcome everybody for joining the webinar today. And please continue with the slide. So today we have our speaker, Paul Roberts. He's a director of education, and we welcome him to come back to our office, our virtual office, to host this seminar. So sorry for the delay a little bit. Thank you so much for your patience. And so Mr. Paul Roberts is a SHRM certified 认证教育市场发展CE 总监. He is he is Accredited SHRM CE Director of Education and Market Development, and he's going to talk about the healthcare changes in response to COVID-19, the American Rescue Plan Act, 2021's option and requirements for health, flexible and dependent care, spending accounts, POPs, PPP, and so much more. So this is our Chinese flyer, and I basically just introduced the whole event in English. So today is going to be bilingual, but we're just going to be speaking in English. All the Chinese speakers, please just go ahead and look at the slides. We have Chinese slides and Chinese information on the screen. So with that said, let's go to the next page. So stay with us until the end of this class, and we'll get 3 chances to win a prize. So CE credits will be available after full attendance, and we will be sending that to you guys, and we're going to give you instructions on how to receive the CE credit. Okay, so if it's your first time attending Zoom, which I hope, I assume that everyone has been to one Zoom class or another. The attendees are in listening mode only, and to ask questions, please put your questions in the chat box, and you may also email the questions into info@epiagroup.com after the webinar, and you can call us 626-912-1988. Once again, this is EPIA hosting this event. Okay, we want to introduce the class. Before I introduce Paul Roberts, we have the introduction, which I'm doing right now. We also have the class, and at the end, we have the raffle. So we will talk to you about the CE credits and how to obtain them also at the end of the class. So this is me. I'm the CEO of EPIA. 我因为今天这个 event 是中英文，所以现在都是英文的话，我就用中文介绍。我们公司1992年成立的，我现在是 CEO。那从2020年开始，2012年开始。那之前我们公司是一个 health insurance specialist, completely benefit providing for 就是健康保险、牙齿保险以及眼睛保险等等的。那在我 take over 之后呢，我们开始做了我们的 workers comp， 就是劳工险以及责任险，还有一些退休的这些 planning。那今天呢，我是以CEO 的身份来 host 这个活动。那我今天还有一些 accolades， 例如说我们是 elite agent， 我们还是 health net top 10 agent。然后我之前也有教过 CE classes to CPE classes for CPAs， and also 我们之前也是有非常多的 CE classes。那在 community 里面呢，我有参与就是一些慈善的活动，以及我们成立了一个 Eric Pale 裴克文 Foundation。那我也是非常一个我也是个母亲，然后希望大家今天能够学到非常多的 information， 然后希望大家都可以拿到中奖，然后以及拿到你的 CE credits。 Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce you today's speaker. His name is Paul Roberts. He's the Director of Education and Market Development. Can we also spotlight Paul Roberts? Okay, so I can explain. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Hi, everybody. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm going to introduce you. Can we also share his slide?
Yeah, let me go ahead and share those right now.
Oh, your introduction. I'm telling the backstage people too. So they get to know you a little bit in case they haven't really been to any of your events that we hosted before. So Paul Roberts is, I will say in Chinese, you guys can read it in English. So Paul Roberts 呢，他是美国人力资源管理协会 SHRM 认证的教育和市场发展的CE总监，他将传授关于如何应对新冠肺炎的医疗保健变化、美国救援计划法案、2021年的健康灵活支出账户和受抚养人灵活支出账户，经保费计划 POP 薪资保护计划 PPP 选项。和其他的一些重要的项目，因为我们现在这个 pandemic 已经开放了哈，所以有非常多需要注意的事项。那今天 Paul Roberts 会为我们带来这些细节。Okay, so Paul, so take it away. What's our next slide?
Awesome. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Awesome. Well, you guys should be able to see my screen right now. I believe everything look okay on your end, Angel?
Yes, I can see the slide.
Awesome. Sounds great. Well, thank you for the nice introduction. And thank you for being here with us, everybody, this morning. All of us at EPIA and Word & Brown are very proud to put this presentation on for you today. We are reaching the end to the pandemic, finally, after a very, very long year and a half. A lot has happened over the last year and a half. The last time you likely heard from me when we were working with EPIA was back in April of 2020, right when things were really starting to hit the fan as the pandemic certainly started to ravage across our country. We had so many new laws that we had to deal with. And what was unique about those laws was that Congress was pulsing them out of Washington, D.C. as quickly as they could. And they needed to pulse them out quickly because the pandemic was growing. It was evolving. The virus was changing. And Congress had to act quickly to create laws and regulations to help us deal with all of the challenging effects of the pandemic. And it was certainly a turbulent time for all of us. The last time we last spoke together back in April of 2020. And so much has happened, of course, over the last 14 months since the last time we both spoke. Unfortunately, the pandemic is not over yet, but we are reaching an end to the pandemic. This class was built around sunsetting the pandemic, the end of the pandemic. Pandemic is nearly over, so what now? Well, there are still a lot of lingering laws that were created over the last 14 to 18 months by Congress that are still very much in play today. Although the requirements are less severe than they were before, there are still things for employers to be aware of as it relates to the pandemic, as the pandemic is reaching an end. There are some things that we need to check in about regarding our health plans, and about other areas of compliance as it relates to our benefits plans and the pandemic, which we'll be speaking about today. This class, of course, as Angel mentioned, is HRCI and SHRM accredited. So if you have your SPHR designations, or you have any designations through SHRM that demonstrate your commitment to education in your HR field, this class counts as a credit for you to keep those designations active. And as Angel mentioned, after the conclusion of this presentation, you can reach out to EPIA directly for the CE information for you to get credits for those designations if you happen to have any of those designations. Also, this class is both an audio and a visual experience. So if you are only dialing in today and can only hear my voice but not seeing the slides, we highly recommend that you follow along with the slides and the full presentation. because as with all things compliance, there is quite a bit of information for us to go over, and it will certainly help you see, it'll help you to see the information and follow along with the class if you're able to experience both the audio and the visual presentation today. It's important to understand too that the presentation today is not intended to be specific legal, medical, financial, tax, or other advice. That's because EPIA and Ward & Brown General Agency, neither of us provide any of those types of legal, medical, financial, or tax related services. This educational material is put together based on conscientious research and all of the experience that we at the Ward & Brown General Agency have in partnering with agencies like EPIA to put this educational program together for you today. Also, it's important to understand that for full compliance with the law, any law, it's always highly recommended that you seek legal counsel to ensure full compliance with the law according to your own specific circumstances. And what's strange about this law, or excuse me, what's strange about the pandemic and what's been unique about the pandemic is that the pandemic has continued to evolve. Things have continued to change day by day. And what we think about and know about the pandemic now is different than what we know and thought back in January, what we know and thought back in summer of last year and before. The virus continues to expand, continues to evolve. We have the new Delta variant out there that is starting to be a very big concern again for a lot of people. And because of that, the reason why I'm talking about this, it's important to understand that what's in place right now might not necessarily be in place tomorrow, or we might potentially see new laws that might be created to help us deal with the changing effects of the pandemic as the pandemic continues to ravage on, but hopefully reaches an end very, very soon. General rule of thumb, all employers should always treat all similarly situated employees the same. That means if you make a situational accommodation for one employee, you should make the same situational accommodation for another employee. That is the general #1 golden rule of compliance in the health insurance space. Again, my name is Paul Roberts. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am the Director of Education and Market Development at the Ward & Brown General Agency. Ward & Brown General Agency is the back office of EPIA Insurance Agency. We partner with EPIA Insurance Agency to bring valuable health insurance solutions over to all of you wonderful clients at EPIA. We are committed to continuing to expand your education to get you the information that you employers need to know as we enter a hopeful end to the pandemic here in summer 2021. So let's go ahead and get into our classes. Get into the class today. I want to start by going over a brief overview of the COVID-19 relief that has come from Washington, D.C. Firstly, the World Health Organization, WHO, firstly declared COVID-19 a national pandemic here in the United States back on March 10th, 2020. So here we are in July, happy July, by the way. So we are about, what is that, 16 months, almost to the day, when the World Health Organization declared a national pandemic because of COVID-19. So none of the things that we are going to be speaking about today existed at all before March 10th, 2020. And a lot of things have happened in relation to the pandemic since then. Firstly, we all remember what it felt like for us back in February or March when things really started to hit the fan, and all of us in the country really started to realize how severe this virus seems to be, and we started to learn what a pandemic is and more. And a lot of us were panicking for sure, and people were sick, and people needed to not come into work when they were sick. Because of that, the federal government created a requirement that said all employers across the country, if you have less than 500 employees, you are required, and this was the first time the federal government required this, you are required to give your employees paid time off if they are unable to work or telework for reasons related to COVID-19, because they were sick and they need to not come into the office to help reduce the spread of the virus, or because they need to take care of somebody else, a family member, Or maybe they're just not feeling too hot and needed to get a diagnosis, or they needed to care for a child who no longer had a place of school to go to because schools were also shut down as we tried to reduce the spread of COVID-19. So this very first major congressional relief came from Washington, D.C., 8 days after the World Health Organization declared the national pandemic, and it created the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Again, it mandated paid time off for people who were unable to work or telework for reasons related to COVID-19. Of course, employers needed help paying for that, so the federal government created a $104 billion account in order to help pay for those leaves, which employers are now required to do. We'll talk about what this leave looks like today and in summer 2021 in a few moments here. The second item that came from Washington, D.C. was the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. That followed just 9 days later from Washington, D.C. And that had that $2.2 trillion price tag on it. And it was intended to stimulate the entire national economy. It provided loans and assistance to businesses. It created the Paycheck Protection Program, which gave employers a way to get a loan that does not need to be paid back as long as employers use that loan for its intended purpose, which is to keep employees on payroll and also help them keep their payments, their employee benefits contributions and benefits in general alive. It also created the first round of stimulus payouts to citizens. We recall there were 3 or 4 of those that were introduced as the virus continued to linger in our country. There wasn't much significant movement from Washington, D.C. from after March 27th, 2020. They did release a bunch of small micro items that helped with the virus and helped with the pandemic and more throughout the year. But largely, there was not any major changes that were introduced as it relates to the pandemic until the very end of 2020. That was a Consolidated Appropriations Act. It was the last piece of legislation that came from the Trump administration, passed by what's called as reconciliation in Washington, D.C. That also had an additional $2.2 trillion price tag, but it covered a bunch of things across our country, a bunch of regulatory items. Only $900 billion of that $2.2 trillion price tag was it belonged to COVID-19 relief. And it created some additional changes. It extended the FFCRA leave that, again, required employers to give employees paid time off if they cannot work because of the pandemic. The Consolidated Appropriations Act also helped give additional funds to the Paycheck Protection Program. It made some cafeteria plan changes for employers that allow their employees to pay for their benefits with pre-tax dollars, for employers that have FSA, flexible spending plans, or HRA plans, health reimbursement arrangement plans, dependent care assistance plans, dependent care FSAs, all of those items which we'll talk about in this class. And that was it for 2020. But of course, when we turned the new leaf, the new page on January 1st, 2021, all of us were so excited to do so. Finally, 2020 was over. But what happened when we woke up on January 1st, 2021? Well, the pandemic was still very much here. It did not go away overnight, unfortunately. And additional relief was needed as the pandemic continued to ravage on. Here we are 7 months into the new year, officially on the second half of the year now on July 1st, and the pandemic is still very much a problem for us, although it certainly is starting to sunset and we're returning back to regular life. The American Rescue Plan Act followed in March 11th, 2021. That had nearly another $2 trillion price tag on it. It created COBRA subsidies. COBRA is a law that allows a person to continue their coverage once they've lost eligibility for that coverage for a certain duration of time. COBRA can be very expensive because when a person continues their plan after they lost eligibility for it, they have to pay what they normally paid as an employee, but also have to pay what the employer paid. And all of you employers know and understand very well that employers often make very generous contributions to employees' benefits. But when employees need to continue COBRA on their own, which many had to do because they were laid off from their jobs because of the virus that is requiring people to see the doctor, when people need to continue their benefits, they have a hard time paying for it. And it was especially problematic for people to continue their benefits from COBRA. Arguably, people never needed COBRA worse than they did because of the pandemic, but also people were laid off from their jobs, they were not earning money, and they had a hard time paying for the expensive group premiums. So the American Rescue Plan Act created subsidies to help Americans who qualify pay for their COBRA premiums, which we'll be talking about. It also created some additional FFCRA extensions as it relates to the vaccine, because we started administering vaccines, thankfully, in 2021. There was additional stimulus payments and more. And I wanted to show this timeline to you. And I want to remind you too that there are a bunch of additional micro laws and items that have come from Washington, D.C. that are not included here. But these are the 4 major laws that have all come from Washington, D.C. since March 2020 to help our nation deal with the stresses and the struggles caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are thankfully sunsetting. And I want to start by talking about the FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, again, which required employers to give paid time off to their employees who are unable to work or telework for reasons related to COVID-19. I also want to talk about an additional bill here in California, which applies to all California employers in 2021 that requires the same thing. I'll explain in just a moment, but let's get into what these laws are. The first one to be aware of, again, is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And again, I want to remind you that it was signed back in March 18th, 2020, which really was not that long ago. And it went into effect on April 1st. Remember what we were thinking back in March 2020. We're having a pandemic. Disneyland is going to be closed for 2 weeks, and it'll open again really soon. We can't wait for these next 2 months to go by so we can get over the pandemic, we can socially distance, and then in summer 2020, we will certainly be able to get back to regular life. Everyone across the country thought that, or at least would like to have thought that. And so when legislators were creating this law, they said, we're going to make this law that says employers need to give paid time off if their employees are unable to work or telework because of the pandemic. And we're going to put it into effect on 4/1, April 1st, 2020, because the pandemic is certainly hot now when they wrote this back in March 2020. And we all thought back in March 2020, again, that certainly by summer 2020, this would be completely over. And so the lawmakers said, we're going to keep this FFCRA law in effect until the end of 2020. Because in March 2020, none of us ever thought, or at least wanted to think, that the pandemic could ever last until 2021, which it certainly has. As the pandemic continued to ravage on, the law was later extended at the employer's discretion, which now can be extended all the way through September 2021, through the end of September, which I'll explain in just a moment here. The law required, and still requires, if the employer desires to offer this option today, the employer requires the employer to provide emergency paid sick leave to employees, again, who are unable to work or telework for reasons related to the pandemic, the virus. That is, if the employee is subject to quarantine or is not feeling hot and is seeking some medical diagnosis, they need to stay at home, they need to not come into work, they need to social distance if they need to quarantine, etc. They need to be incentivized to stay at home. So the government says, employers, you need to pay employees when they stay at home for these reasons, and we as a federal government will help you pay for that. For this type of leave, employees were eligible to take up to 80 hours leave, so 2 weeks. We quarantine for 2 weeks, the amount of time is 2 weeks, and employees need to be paid at their regular rate of pay. The IRS was helping reimburse employers for this payment up to $511 a day. But what happens to the employees who can't come into work, not because they're sick themselves or they're subject to a government order of quarantine or a doctor's order of quarantine, but they need to take care of their kids who no longer have a place of school to go to because of the pandemic, which was a really big problem for very, very, very many Americans. And so for this reason, if employees were unable to work or telework because they needed to care for their kids, they could take an additional 10 weeks of leave. However, the pay was limited to 2/3 of their rate of pay, capped at $200 a day, again, paid for firstly by employers and reimbursed by the IRS. And this law applied to all employers across the country with less than 500 employees. And again, tax credits were available up to the maximums I just mentioned to help employers pay for these required new leaves. But remember that this law, the FFCRA, was not optional in 2020, from April 1st all the way through the end of 2020. It wasn't optional. But when we woke up on January 1st, 2021, we still had the pandemic here, unfortunately. And we all remember back in January of this year when it hit our country, especially us here in California, particularly hard. And I told you that the Consolidated Appropriations Act, the CAA, which was signed on December 27th, 2020, allowed for optional extensions of the FFCRA. They did not come back in from Washington, D.C. and say, we are going to force all employers to continue providing this leave. But what they did say is that we are aware that the pandemic is still ravaging on and a lot of employees still need to not come into work if they're sick. So if the employer desires to continue offering this leave, the employer can do so, and we, the federal government, will allow the employer relief with regard to payment for such leaves if the employer decides to do so. And of course, many employers did decide to do so because number one, they don't want their employees coming into work when they're sick, especially with potentially COVID-19 virus. And B, they did it because it simply was just the right thing to do. However, many employers, especially ones in other parts of the country, not in California, might have decided not to offer this leave because it is problematic and it is another administration burden onto employers. I will say that most employers in California, including all of you, likely have opted to extend this because of an additional law that was created here in California, which I'll explain in just a moment. But under the CAA, which again was signed at the end of December in 2020, they said employers, you can continue to offer this FFCRA leave if you want to, and you can do so until the end of March. And you have to do so under the same conditions as the original law. If you want to continue this, you can. If you do, nothing else changes. The same allowances apply to everybody, 2 weeks of time if you can't come to work because you're sick with the virus or seeking diagnosis, or up to 10 weeks if you need to care for a child who has no place in school to go to. Again, employers are not required to offer this FFCRA-like leave, but they can if they want to. And most, if not all, employers in California are doing this because of a California law, which I'll explain in just a moment. But again, what happened on April 1st, 2021? Well, we started a new month and the pandemic was very much still here. And legislators were thinking about that back in March. The American Rescue Plan Act, which created COBRA subsidies, was signed March 11, 2021. And that extended and expanded the FFCRA further because we still have a need for this type of leave. And so it says, employers, if you would like to continue offering this FFCRA-like leave, you can choose to do so, and you can continue to do so all the way through the end of September in 2021. The FFCRA leave first began on April 1st, 2020. So when this extension was made by the American Rescue Plan Act, this extended the time of leave past 1 year because this addition to the FFCRA began on April 1st, 2021, 1 year after the FFCRA initially took place. Because of that, there were some changes that can be adopted by the employer. Firstly, the employer can, at its discretion, allow all of their employees to reset their balance because, unfortunately, people can get the COVID-19 virus twice. They might need to still be providing care for their kids who have no place for school or childcare to go to for reasons related to the pandemic. So the employers can, at their discretion, if they adopt this additional leave all the way through the end of September, they can reset the clock for employees' leaves for the employee paid sick leave and the emergency family medical leave, which again allows employees to take time off if they need to care for their kids who have no place in school to go to. Also in March, we were administering vaccines and are still administering vaccines across the country. The law was also changed to include time off for people who need to get their vaccines, where they're waiting results from the COVID-19 test, or they are recovering from complications due to a vaccine. Many of us got very sick because of the vaccine administration and needed time off. The federal government wanted to encourage employees to get the vaccine, and so they created this type of leave, which includes leave for reasons related to the vaccine if employers decide to adopt it. Again, this is optional across the country, but in California, most employers adopted this law because in California, there is an additional requirement that is not optional, and it applies to all California employers with 26 or more employees. Employers in California are required to offer at least 2 weeks of paid sick leave to employees who are unable to work or telework for reasons related to the pandemic. That is not optional. It is mandatory here in California. But California is not helping employers pay for this type of leave. California is saying if you want to give this type of, you're required to give this type of leave. And when you do, you can optionally extend the FFCRA credits to take advantage of what the federal government is providing, which will allow you employers to offer this type of leave. This law was signed by our governor here in California on March 19th, 2021. And when they wrote it in California, they thought there's probably a lot of people that should have gotten paid for time off that they needed to take in 2021 for reasons related to the pandemic. And so they made this retroactive and they said, although we're signing this on March 19th, 2021, employees, if you needed to take time off because you were unable to work or telework for any of those reasons I just mentioned to you, you can get retroactively compensated for any time off that you did not get compensated for that was taken during 2021. This is a requirement. There are some pitfalls to be aware of for all of you employers. The law requires the employers to send or display a notice. After the conclusion of this webinar, Angel and the EPIA team and Danielle will be sending you a follow-up email, which contains not only copies of the slides, by the way, but also that very important notice that must be posted in a common area and or emailed to your employees. The law also requires employers to itemize payouts for this type of leave that's required under California's SB 95 onto employees' pay stubs. The next thing I want to talk about briefly is the CARES Act's Paycheck Protection Program. So this goes into the second item of congressional relief from Congress that came at the end of March 2020. I know all of you employers recall this law, or excuse me, recall this program very well because it helps so many employers across the country who were struggling during the pandemic. It applied to employers with less than 500 employees, and it was aimed to help employers keep their employees employed during the pandemic when employers largely were unable to operate their businesses because of items related to the pandemic. Now, this program got extended and extended and extended over time. It initially was only going to be available for a couple of months, but it was a highly popular program that is with a special utility as a pandemic continued to linger. And again, this program, it applies to businesses with less than 500 employees. The program was available, or was at least supposed to be available, until the end of May of this year, but the funds depleted. They ran out on May 4th. About $821 billion of funding was provided through the Paycheck Protection Program. The Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, allowed employers to take loans that do not need to be paid back as long as those employers use those loans on rent and utility expenses and also payroll. Payroll, by the way, under Paycheck Protection Program does include health benefits. And they could do that for 18 to 24 weeks. Employers were able to get 2.5 times their monthly payroll because they were supposed to initially use this across an 8-week period. That's 2 months. And they can also have some money to pay for their rent and utilities. So they could take 2.5 times their monthly payroll, and they could opt to give that funds to their employees across an 8-week period or a 24-week period. And this program was so popular and so needed by so many employers that many employers were able to take 2 loans out for 4 different months across the year if they needed them. But it was more difficult to qualify for the second Paycheck Protection Program loan. You certainly did not want to be one of those employers in this category, though many were. If you needed the second loan for the Paycheck Protection Program, which many people did, there were more stringent qualifications to qualify. And I want to show you how highly utilized the Paycheck Protection Program is. Like I told you, there were additional items from Congress that I did not include in the initial slides, some small micro ones. The second item on this chart is an example of one of those small micro items that came from Washington, D.C. at the end of April. The Paycheck Protection Program was initially made available on April 3rd, 2020. The program was supposed to be available for 2 months initially, but the funds dried up in less than 2 weeks. Because of that, the program was popular. Federal government needed to enhance and increase funding, which they did just 21 days later after the program launched. But this chart illustrates to you how much funding was largely made available through the Paycheck Protection Program. The final amount of funding was released into the program on March 11th with the American Rescue Plan Act, which totaled $821 billion. And again, it was supposed to be available through the end of May, but on the 4th of May and announced on the 5th of May, the program ran out of funds because they were all utilized, and the program has not been funded further from that. The next thing I want to speak about is the Employee Retention Tax Credit. That is similar to the Paycheck Protection Program in that it helps employers keep their employees on their payroll. I'd like to let you know that while we have information that we can share with you on this tax law, it's important for you employers to speak with your tax advisors, your CPAs, your legal counsel for help understanding these tax laws as they apply to you and your businesses and your specific circumstances. But the Employee Retention Tax Credit is abbreviated as ERC. And again, it is intended to keep, to encourage businesses to keep their employees on payroll in a similar way that the Paycheck Protection Program was encouraging employees to keep their businesses on payroll. This was also a very popular program. It allowed qualifying employers to claim a tax credit for all of the wages that they paid to their workers who they retained during the payroll of the pandemic. So basically, if you made a payment to your employees during the pandemic, you made your payroll, you might be able to get a tax credit from the IRS, which reimburses you for making those payments to your employers or to your employees. This law was firstly enacted under the CARES Act, signed at the end of March in 2020. And it limited the amount of payouts for this up to 50% of the qualified wages that you paid out, which sounds really exciting. 50% of the wages you paid out, who would not love the IRS to give you tax credits for that? But the IRS said, we're going to put a cap on that though, and we're only going to let you, we're only going to reimburse you for up to 50% of the first $10,000 of payroll you give to a person. And so that allowed the employer to get a maximum of $5,000 back from the IRS for payroll made to their employees between March 13th, 2020 and December 31st, 2020. But a lot of employers, at least at first anyways, decided not to take the Employee Retention Tax Credit because the way that the laws were originally written, you could only get either the Paycheck Protection Program, again, 2.5 times your entire monthly payroll that you do not need to pay back at all, as long as you use it for your intended purposes, which is to pay for payroll and also pay your rent and utilities. You don't need to pay that back. Or you could get the Employee Retention Tax Credit, which is restricted to a maximum of $5,000 per employee. Frankly, the Paycheck Protection Program got employers a lot better assistance, and so most employers decided to go to the Paycheck Protection Program because the law initially said that employers must choose one or the other, but cannot choose both. That caused a lot of problems for very struggling employers. That was later changed. It was amended by the American Rescue Plan Act, signed in March of this year. And it said that employers who claim Paycheck Protection Program loans can also claim the Employee Retention Tax Credit for qualified wages that are not considered payroll costs when obtaining forgiveness for the Paycheck Protection Program loan, retroactive all the way back to the beginning of March. Of course, this is a very simple summarization of very complicated tax matters, so it's important that you speak to your tax professionals about how this Employee Retention Tax Credit might apply over to you. Right now, this Employee Retention Tax Credit has also been extended over time. It currently is available all the way through December 31st of this year. And in 2021, it is capped at 70% of qualifying wages. So not 50%, but 70% of qualifying wages Of course, the $10,000 maximum does apply, but it applies per quarter in 2021. So thus the maximum employee retention tax credit for an employee is $7,000 per employee per quarter, up to a total of $28,000 per employee in 2021, which sounds excellent. But the eligibility requirements for the employee retention tax credit are very stringent and tight. And frankly, you do not want to be an employer that needs to take this type of credit. However, many employers do, and we're very thankful that it's available. Firstly, in order to qualify for this, your business must still be fully or partially suspended due to COVID-19, requirements from the local or federal government that would restrict your business from operating. You also needed to show at least a 20% or more decrease in your gross receipts compared to the same calendar quarter in 2021 to 2019. So we hope that none of you employers are in that boat, but if you are, this might be a credit that is available to you. And again, we recommend that you speak to your tax advisors about this credit and how it might apply to you and your specific tax situation. The next thing I want to talk about that I know is driving all of you employers crazy out there are the COBRA changes that were made in relation to the pandemic. This is not a COBRA class. I wish we had more time to speak about COBRA, but COBRA firstly is a federal law. It applies to employers with 20 or more employees. All employers across the country, if you have 20 or more employees, you are subject to federal COBRA. Federal COBRA requires employers to give employees the option to continue their benefits once they've lost eligibility for those plans. The problem, though, is that, again, when employees lose eligibility for their employer plans, they also lose eligibility for the generous contribution that employers are making for those benefits. And so when an employee gets the option to continue their benefits, they can do so, but they need to pay 100% of the entire gross premium. That is, whatever they were paying as an employee, plus whatever the employer was paying by way of the employer contribution, which is generally very significant. And most employees don't understand how much their employers are contributing to their health benefits until they get their COBRA notice and realize how expensive their overall premium is, which I know all of you employers can understand very well. That is the simplest version of what COBRA is. Again, it applies to employers with 20 or more employees. Here in California, though, we have what's called a mini COBRA law that applies to employers with less than 20 employees in a little bit of a different circumstance. It's a similar law, but has some significant changes, which we'll talk more about in just a few moments. But firstly, I want to talk about some troubling changes made to COBRA administration by the federal government. This relates only to federal COBRA. So again, for employers that have 20 or more employees that offer benefits to their employees, they're subject to federal COBRA law, and these outbreak period changes that I'm about to describe to you apply to all of those employers. So the outbreak period came in 2020, and it came back in April 2020, and it relates to COBRA. We remember what happened in April 2020. We suddenly had to shut down the majority of our country. Pretty much all schools closed, all restaurants closed, all entertainment closed, malls closed, shopping closed, everything closed. We shut the entire country down, and certainly thought back in April we'd open it up in 2 weeks. That didn't happen, of course. But in April 2020, it was unique because suddenly many of us were without jobs, not by our own choice, but because employers were required to lay employees off since their businesses were forced to be closed. Hopefully they didn't have to do that because of the Paycheck Protection Program, but let's be real, many employers did not survive the pandemic, unfortunately. But there was a problem with all the people who suddenly lost their jobs. Well, now they don't have a paycheck, and they need a paycheck more than ever because of the pandemic. You can't get jobs because jobs are not available. Everybody, not everybody, but a very significant portion of America had been laid off. People were worried about how they were going to pay their rent, how they were going to feed themselves without getting a paycheck. Also, employers were not going into the office. All of us remember that as well. Many employers were unable to send mail and receive mail like they normally would because all of us were staying at home, quarantining, social distancing, doing whatever we can to help curb the spread of COVID-19. And that created a lot of problems for employees who need their health benefits. They need to be able to continue them because of the pandemic that's going on. But there was a problem because employees, although they would like to continue their benefits, they likely were unable to afford to do so because most Americans live paycheck to paycheck and simply cannot afford their very expensive employer sponsored coverage premiums once they're responsible for 100% of them. That was a very big problem that we frankly hadn't experienced in our country since the creation of federal COBRA law. And so the IRS and the Department of Labor issued a notice in April 2020, and they said, look, we acknowledge and apologize, I guess. We acknowledge all of the things I just mentioned to you. And so what we are doing, IRS and Department of Labor, is we're going to say, look, there is a period of time that health plans, that's the plans that you sponsor, are required to just disregard when determining due dates for certain actions. That impacted COBRA elections and COBRA premium payment. It also impacted some other items in our space, which I'm not going to get into. The focus that I want to talk about now is on COBRA. The period of time, they said, is we're going to call this the outbreak period. So as long as this as the COBRA, as long as the COVID virus is ravaging across the country, we are going to be what's called we are going to be in what is known as an outbreak period. During this outbreak period, employers, you are to disregard any and all due dates for people who want to elect COBRA or people who want to pay their COBRA premiums. Again, people might not have been able to elect COBRA because their employers might not have been able to send them their COBRA election notices because their employers were not going to work. Employees might not be able to receive their notices anyways because employees might be caring for somebody with the COVID-19 virus. They themselves might be sick or in the hospital, might not be able to get their COBRA enrollment forms like they normally would. Also, people couldn't pay for their premiums because they've lost their jobs. And so they essentially said, during this outbreak period, we are not going to enforce the normal deadlines that we do with regard to electing COBRA and keeping your premium payments active and whole the entire time. And so the outbreak period, again, this came in April 2020. Remember what we thought about how the virus looked in April 2020. This came in April 2020 and said the outbreak period is going to begin on March 1st, 2020. So it's going to be retroactive and it'll end whenever the President of the United States declares an end to the national emergency. When the President of the United States says the national emergency is over, there is an additional 60 days added, at which point everyone's deadlines will resume. It was challenging, but easy enough to understand. So again, pause all of the related deadlines that fall during this outbreak period, which began March 1st, 2020 until whenever the president says the national emergency is over, add 60 days after there, and you continue operating as normal. That was challenging, but simple enough, I suppose. There's a problem though. In the health insurance regulatory space, the ocean of regulatory law and health insurance industry, is called ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. It is a major, major federal law. And ERISA law dictates what all health plans employers can and cannot do related to their health plans. ERISA law says Department of Labor and IRS, you can you can hit the pause button if you want to, but you can't allow people to hit the pause button for longer than a year. Doing so would require a significant change to long-standing federal law, which frankly, legislators did not have time to do. But when this law was written in April 2020, certainly no one ever thought that we would still be dealing with the pandemic 1 year later at the beginning of March in 2021, which we certainly did end up experiencing. So I was really nervous personally because, again, you can only hit the pause button for up to 1 year. The notice came out on March 1st, and here I was sitting in my home office. I live in downtown San Diego, by the way, sitting here right now on February 26th, 2 days before the end of this 1 year period. I'm thinking, what is going on? The President of the United States has still not declared an end to the national emergency, which is still true today in July 2021. What is going to happen about all of these COBRA outbreak deadlines which people were asking me about? Well, we finally got guidance on February 26th, which made it more complicated. And so the guidance says, okay, ERISA, we understand the ERISA law, we understand we can only allow people to hit pause for a year. We certainly didn't think that this was going to go on longer than a year. Unfortunately, it has, and these are the cards we've been dealt. And so because of that, we're going to change our outbreak period guidance. So instead of just applying the pause button to people for the same period of time until 60 days after the conclusion of the national emergency, the national emergency is going on for longer than that, and we can only allow you to hit the pause button for 1 year. So instead of applying it to the outbreak period, we will apply it to the individual's affected time period. So that means that when a person loses eligibility for their coverage, the time frame will expire on a rolling basis as determined by that person's loss of eligibility time date. You cannot hit the pause button for longer than 1 year. This made administration of federal COBRA very challenging for employers who now have to look at each person's loss of eligibility date, add up to 1 year of time for that, until the national emergency is declared over by the President of the United States, at which point you add an additional 60 days after that date, whenever it is. But again, you cannot allow employees to hit the pause button on these due dates for up to a year because of some changes, or excuse me, some requirements in ERISA law. And again, on the applicable date up to 1 year later, the timeframes will resume. Again, the disregarded period cannot extend longer than 1 year. So I know it's confusing to follow along. I put this slide up here to kind of give you an illustration of what I'm talking about. So first, what you need to do is you identify the original due date and you add 1 year to it. And that will continue until the national emergency concludes. When it concludes, you add 60 days on there. But remember, you cannot allow any person to hit pause for longer than 1 year. So a person that would have been required to make a COBRA election by April 1st, 2020, they can only have the pause button hit up for 1 year. They would have had up until April 1st, 2021 to make their elections and make all their premium payments whole. Another example, let's say the beneficiary, qualified beneficiary, the person eligible for COBRA, would have been required to make a COBRA election by March 1st of this year, 2021. Well, because of the outbreak period guidance, they have until March 1st, 2022, unless the national emergency ends before then. If the national emergency ends before then you add 60 days after the end of that national emergency, but you cannot extend and pause the deadlines longer than March 1st, 2022. Pitfalls for employers to be aware of: you should update your COBRA notices and your plan documents with these changes, set notices at the end of the relief period, track deadlines for people, and coordinate with your COBRA third-party administrator, which helps you deal with all of the administration related to COBRA. That brings us to the next, even more challenging item with COBRA related to the American Rescue Plan Act COBRA subsidies. So the COBRA subsidies were created in March 2021, 11 months after the outbreak period guidance first came along, which made things even more complicated. So the IRS says, look, we realize in March 2021, we're writing this new law. Look, a lot of people need to elect COBRA. They're unable to do so because it is so expensive. People need coverage. We need to help citizens with that coverage. The IRS says we are going to subsidize COBRA premiums for assistance eligible individuals, AEIs. That's people who have lost coverage due to an involuntary termination or reduction of hours. And that includes, of course, not only the employee, but their spouse and dependents if they have them. And the COBRA subsidies are available for a 6-month period. They began April 1st and they are available until the end of September of 2021. They apply to medical, dental, and vision, all of those different health insurance policies, but not to health flexible spending accounts. It does not, however, extend any of the COBRA time periods. It is not subject to any of the outbreak period guidance. Why is that? The COBRA subsidies are only available for a 6-month window. In order to utilize them, you need to elect them now so that they can be applied as we are in the midst of this 6-month window. What's really challenging about this law is that the American Rescue Plan Act is a federal law that applies to all employers in the federal COBRA category with 20 or more employees. The American Rescue Plan Act, written by federal legislators, they looked at federal COBRA law and said, we are going to make these subsidies available for all employees, all employers subject to federal COBRA based on federal COBRA administration. But there was a caveat in the law that says these subsidies are also available if your states offer mini COBRA options. Like we have here in California, we have Cal COBRA, which applies to employers with less than 20 employees. It allows the same thing for employees. They can continue their benefits once they've lost eligibility for their health insurance plans. The biggest difference, though, is that federal COBRA is administered by the employer and or the employer's third-party COBRA administrator versus Cal COBRA, which is generally administered 100% by health insurance carriers. Again, federal COBRA applies to 20 or more employers with 20 or more employees. Cal COBRA applies to employers here in California that have less than 20 employees. So for federal COBRA, 20 or more, this was very clear in the law. They said employers, you firstly need to front the cost of all of your COBRA premiums for your assistance eligible individuals, people who have involuntarily lost their job, and of course their benefits, or people who had their hours reduced from full-time to part-time, which made them lose their health insurance benefits. So employers, you need to pay 100% of those COBRA premiums. When you do, and you file your FICA taxes, which is when you pay your Medicare and payroll taxes, you can deduct whatever dollars you forwarded to help those employees, assistance eligible individuals pay for their COBRA premiums. You do so using IRS Form 941. If you do not have enough reserves in your FICA bank account, then you can request an advance from the IRS if you need to using Form 7200. What's challenging, though, is that the federal law says, hey, this applies to Cal COBRA as well. The big difference, though, is that the employer is largely not involved at all with Cal COBRA administration. The employer doesn't involve itself with payments. The carrier sends bills directly to the participant pays the carrier directly. The employer is largely out of the equation for Cal COBRA. The federal law says this law applies in the same way to Cal COBRA, but again, a big problem is that employers never pay premiums in the Cal COBRA space. American Rescue Plan Act, federal law cannot change state law. So how will this work? There was a lot of confusion there. And it took carriers a lot of time to figure out how they were going to implement these changes in the law. For Cal COBRA, generally, carriers, again, administer the entire program, which includes payment, collecting payment. And because of that, the Cal COBRA carriers generally front the premiums for Cal COBRA people with regard to the subsidies and then chase reimbursement from the IRS at a later time. The subsidies are available to people in the federal and Cal COBRA categories. So any person that loses eligibility for the coverage now involuntarily or due to reduction of hours, of course, is subject to the subsidy. They can elect COBRA and do not need to pay for it at all because the employer or the carrier firstly must do so and then request reimbursement from the IRS. Of course, this also applies to any person that had COBRA before the window began on April 1st, 2020 that has COBRA coverage into the current subsidy window. And it gets even more complicated for federal COBRA because the law also says, look, we know that a lot of people, at least in the federal COBRA space, this does not apply to Cal COBRA, but they said, look, we know a lot of people would like to have elected COBRA, but they just simply didn't do so because it's so expensive. People might have changed their minds if they knew that they were going to have a subsidy available to help them pay for this coverage. So maybe people might want to go back and elect COBRA now that we, the federal government, are helping them pay for it. And so they said, we're going to make a change to federal COBRA because we can do that as federal legislators. We'll make a change to federal COBRA because we're making a federal American Rescue Plan Act with COBRA subsidies that says, employers, if you are in the federal category and you have any of your employees who are still in their maximum COBRA window, which is 18 months, a person can continue their COBRA coverage under federal COBRA for 18 months. If you have any employees who are in an 18-month window that reaches into any part of the subsidy period, which is April 1st through the end of September this year, they need to be offered the opportunity to re-elect, have a second bite of the apple, re-elect, and take advantage of COBRA now, either beginning on the COBRA subsidy date or beginning on the date they make their election. It's the employees or AEI, assistance eligible individuals, discretion to decide when they want to enroll. Of course, the outbreak period is still a factor. If a person wants to elect this, they need to respond to their outstanding notices that might be on pause due to the outbreak period changes that I just described to you a few moments ago. So again, you also can have that retroactive election period. This only applies in the federal COBRA space. Again, that applies to any of those assistance eligible individuals who lost coverage prior to April 1st, 2021, and are still in their 18-month COBRA subsidy window. So here in front of you is a chart right now that shows to you, federal employers, the timeframes that people have to elect COBRA. If a person was involuntarily terminated or lost their coverage or had a reduction from full-time to part-time hours back in November 2019, they would have been eligible for federal COBRA if you're a federal COBRA employer for an 18-month window. That would have lasted until April 30th, 2021. The subsidies began April 1st, 2021. So at least for this person terminated November 2019, they would be eligible for at least 1 month subsidy. Why is that? They would have been able to have COBRA for 18 months. That last 18 month reaches into the current COBRA subsidy window. And so they need to be offered the option to re-elect to utilize a subsidy for that 1 month. And of course, as the months continue to progress, the time period extends. Any person that was terminated involuntarily or had their job hours reduced from April 2020, moving forward will be eligible to re-elect and re-enroll COBRA, take a second bite of the apple on federal COBRA to take advantage of the entire subsidy because of the way that the law was written. Remember though, the second bite of the apple only applies to employers that are in the federal COBRA category with 20 or more employees. There's also a caveat in the law that says employers, if you want to, at least in the federal COBRA category, you can allow your employees to downgrade their plans. They can change their plans now to a less expensive option. Employers, you do not need to offer this. If you want to, you can. Make sure that your carrier is cool with it too. If you do, many employers are not opting to allow their employees to downgrade their plans. Frankly, many employers are thinking if the federal government is offering to pay for this benefit right now, why would a person say, let me switch to a cheaper, less rich plan while the premiums are not charged to me at all? There's a big administration challenge to employers that desire to let their employees reduce their coverage. Why would an employer want to allow their employee to reduce their coverage? Well, once the subsidies are no longer available, a person can continue COBRA, but of course would have to pay for it on their own. This would make the premium cheaper once the subsidy expires if a person desires to continue this on their own. Again, this is a requirement only for federal COBRA. However, many Cal COBRA employers are offering this option because it's available to them through their health insurance carrier. There are several notices that needed to be distributed in order to administer these changes in the law. These notices are primarily sent out directly by the employer in the federal COBRA category. And if you are in the Cal COBRA category, again, because it's administered by the health insurance carriers, you do not need to worry about this too much because the carriers will be taking care of this for you employers in the Cal COBRA category with less than 20 employees. There firstly is a general notice and a COBRA election notice. It explains all the things I've just explained to you, although in more detail, and allows a person to elect COBRA coverage. There's also a very, very detailed description of how the COBRA premium assistance works under the American Rescue Plan Act. It also includes a way for a person to say, I believe I'm eligible for assistance. My employer is thinking otherwise. What do I do about it? There's a way to address that in the second notice that must be sent out. If you are in the federal COBRA category and your employees or assistance eligible individuals have that second bite of the apple option, you need to send them an extended, a notice in connection with that extended election period. Once the COBRA subsidy is about to expire, between 15 to 45 days before it expires, the employer is required to send out a notice letting them know the subsidy is no longer going to be available. Here are what your options are. Again, carriers send out all of this stuff. If you are less than 20 employees, 20 or more, you and or your federal COBRA third-party administrator will be helping you send these notices out. Most of these notices have already been sent out because they were due by May 31st, 2021. There's also an additional state continuation notice that applies only to employers in the Cal COBRA category, which again, carriers are largely sending out on behalf of employees. Last thing I want to talk about briefly here before we wrap up the remainder of our class here are changes that are available to account-based plans for you employers that have health flexible spending accounts and dependent care flexible spending accounts, otherwise known as DCAP, dependent care assistance programs. I want to start by talking about some high-level features within flexible spending accounts. Flexible spending accounts firstly have use it or lose it provisions in them. Flexible spending account allows an employee to set aside a certain amount of dollars that will not be taxed. It'll be taken out of their paycheck before taxes are applied, where they can put them into an account. And employees can pull from that account to reimburse themselves for expenses that they need to pay for related to their healthcare throughout the year. That can be drug benefits, that can be co-insurance, co-payments, deductibles, all those types of things all of us are likely already paying for. We can pay for on a pre-tax basis if our employers offer flexible spending account options for us, which many employers do. However, there are significant stipulations in the law. We can't get into details with all those stipulations in the short time we have left here, but what's important for you to be aware of is that FSAs have a use it or lose it rule within them. Employees that over-elect and say, hey, I want you to take out $2,000 of my paycheck over the year. And then they get to the end of the year and realize I was only able to reimburse myself for $500. There's an extra $1,500 there that I didn't use. You will essentially lose that if you do not use the dollars by the end of the plan year. That's the way that it's written in the law. But many employers out there are not trying to screw their employees out of the dollars they've elected into their flexible spending accounts. And so they have options that allow employees to circumvent these use it or lose it rules by allowing one of two options if they desire to. The first one is a carryover, where the employers can say, look, if you over-elect, you're not going to lose all of the dollars that are left there. I will let you move a certain amount of dollars over from one plan year into the next. Before the pandemic, you could only allow up to $500 from one plan year to the next. They could also offer a grace period extension. So if they don't want to offer the carryover, they can offer the grace period extension. And that says your plan year is 12 months, but if you over-elected, you didn't use all of the funds in there, you then would get an additional 2.5 months to continue incurring expenses to reimburse yourself for so that you can use your dollars that you've elected before they've been lost. Before the pandemic, these were restricted to 2.5 months. You couldn't allow the grace period for longer than 2.5 months. Also, another thing to be aware of about health flexible spending accounts is that health flexible spending accounts, when an employer has one, the employer also has what's known as a premium only plan, which allows employers to take benefit contributions out on a pre-tax basis. Of course, employers can simply have this premium only plan without a health flexible spending account. If they do, it simply tells the IRS the employer has the ability to take dollars out of employees' paychecks to let them fund their benefits on a pre-tax basis. A caveat of this, though, for the flexible spending accounts and also for employees paying for their benefits with pre-tax dollars, is that the elections the employees made are irrevocable. So you need to keep whatever elections you've made until the conclusion of the plan year because you're paying for benefits with pre-tax basis. So there are significant changes that were made available to employees in relation to the pandemic because of some of the challenges that we've experienced in relation to the pandemic that have been problematic with the continuation items that I just explained to you, the carryover provision and the grace period. The first one allows a carryover of unused funds for the plan year. So that has been in existence for a long time. But a lot of people made their FSA elections at the beginning of 2020, not knowing that a pandemic would be here. And of course, a lot of us / all of us had to delay any elective surgeries that we might have otherwise elected for in our flexible spending account. So people could have significantly over-elected their flexible spending accounts and were not able to use their funds because of the pandemic. So this applies to health flexible spending accounts and dependent care flexible spending accounts. Dependent care flexible spending accounts is basically the same thing as a health FSA, although it allows an employee to use pre-tax dollars to pay for dependent care services if their employer has that plan. And this allows employers to change those use it or lose it rules for employers that have plan years ending in 2020 or ending in 2021. They can allow 100% of unused funds to be carried over from one plan year into the next, as opposed to the normal cap, which is $500. Right now, there is no cap on the carriers, again, for plan years ending in 2020 or in 2021. Employers do not need to offer this extension if they don't want to. However, they can at their discretion, and most employers have made this change. Another thing to be aware of is that there are special allowances permitted with regard to the grace period options, where again, normally an employer could say, if you didn't use all of your funds, we can give you an additional 2.5 months to incur new funds and to reimburse yourself for them. This period can now be changed. And because of the pandemic, again, people are in unique circumstances. The employer can say, not only will we allow you to have a grace period for 2.5 months, in fact, we can allow you to have a grace period of up to 12 months to continue using your funds because so many people were unable to use them as they relate to the pandemic. Again, this is not a required option, but this is an option that's available to employers at their discretion if they decide to offer it. Also, there is a post-termination health flexible spending account, health flexible spending account spend down. When you terminate your eligibility for the plan with the employer, you lose eligibility for your FSA. Now you can continue that on COBRA if you want to, but a lot of people don't. Doesn't make sense to do so. When you otherwise terminate your employment with your employer, you lose the funds in your FSA account unless you continue it via COBRA. A lot of people were suddenly without work and they couldn't continue their plan via COBRA if they wanted to. People needed to use their funds. And so while you normally would lose your funds, if you lose eligibility for your plan, you can continue tapping into those funds if you would like to after you've lost eligibility for that plan during 2020 or 2021. This is another optional extension that employers have and they can give to their employees if they want to. Dependent care FSA changes were also made as well. Normally, you can reimburse yourself for dependent care for a dependent through the age of 13. So once they hit 14, you can't reimburse yourself for expenses for them. Well, what happens if you had an employee with a 13-year-old son or daughter and they made their FSA elections for, their dependent care elections, and then the pandemic hit and they weren't able to use their dependent care dollars because no child care was available as it relates to the pandemic? That was really problematic. And so because of that, for the 2020 plan year, if you were in that situation, the IRS is now allowing people to reimburse themselves for expenses for children all the way through age 14, as opposed to through age 13. Again, this is only for the 2020 plan year, and this is optional if the employer has this plan and wants to implement it. Also, the law was changed, which allows an increase in elections for dependent care spending accounts up to $10,500 per household. Very last thing to be aware of here, normally when you make your elections, as I mentioned, in your FSA plans, your dependent care plans, and if you pay for your benefits on a pre-tax basis, you cannot change your elections until the conclusion of the plan year. So the plan that you've elected needs to stay in place until the conclusion of the plan year, unless of course you move out of the service area for your HMO, you add a dependent, you lose a dependent, whatever it might be. Otherwise, you largely need to keep your plans and your elections the same. Many people needed to change their plans or needed to elect coverage when they opted to waive it initially because they didn't know a pandemic would be here. They didn't know they needed it. And so while you normally cannot change your elections at all for the most part, there's some challenges with that. So the IRS said employers, if you have FSA or dependent care plan years that end in 2021, you can allow your employees to say, I want to change my election. I want to increase it. I want to decrease it, whatever it might be. Employers, you have this option if you want to. The IRS rules also clarified that this also applies to health benefits. So if your employees want to change their plans, they want to enhance their plans to a more rich plan, or they want to reduce their plans as active employees, from an IRS tax perspective, that's normally not allowed, but it is okay and permissible now from the IRS tax perspective. But of course, it's important to also make sure that not only it's cool with the IRS, but more importantly, or additionally important, to check with your health insurance carrier to make sure the health insurance carrier is okay with you allowing your employees to upgrade and downgrade your plans. I know this has been so much information to go over with all of you guys, and likely is a little bit overwhelming. There's so much for us to talk about as it relates to the pandemic, reaching an end of the pandemic. And all of us at EPIA certainly hope you found the information helpful, and we hope that we hope that you're doing well, and we hope that you enjoy the summer ahead, enjoy the month of July as we reach an end of the pandemic. With that, Angel, I'd like to turn the presentation back over to you to see if we have any Q&A or anything else you'd like to chat about before we wrap this up. Oops, you're on mute, Angel.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Sure.
And I definitely myself, I learned a lot as well. So thank you for always supporting us to be the authority in employee benefits. And I do have some questions myself for everybody that might have. I do feel like if there are employers on here, if they belong in CalCobra, you said that the carrier will actually submit the notifications to all these new rules to all the employees or all the employers. However, if they belong in regular COBRA, if they have 20 or more employees, will they have to prepare these notifications themselves, or are we going to provide any templates for them to facilitate the process?
That's a really good question. So federal COBRA requires the employer to administer the COBRA entirely themselves. Most employers partner with a COBRA third-party administrator that helps them deal with all of the COBRA requirements and administration challenges. So if you are an employer that's in the federal COBRA category, there's a very good chance that you're partnering with a COBRA third-party administrator to help you with your COBRA administration. That third-party administrator will help the employer send out these notices, but the law says still, even if you use a third-party administrator, the law is still an employer law. Employers need to comply with it. However, the third-party administrators will help you comply with the law. That's what their job is to do. But it's important to engage with those third-party administrators to make sure that they, A, are doing so, and B, have the information they need to get these notices out. You heard me mention that COBRA subsidies are only available to assistance eligible individuals. That is, people who've lost eligibility for their health plans due to an involuntary job loss or a reduction of hours. The third-party administrator firstly might need the employer to tell it which people are assistance eligible individuals according to the reason they were terminated, so that the subsidy notices can be sent out by the third-party administrator. Either way, though, the law says, regardless of whether you use a third-party administrator, this is an employer law. Employers, you are responsible for getting these notices out. Thankfully, there are model notices that have been made available through the Department of Labor. Again, the ones I went over with you, that have all of the information on them that you need to send out. However, the employer still needs to update those notices with the employer's name, with the cost of the COBRA premium and more in order to operate the subsidy.
Thank you for that answer. So here, can you actually take off the slideshow, please? So people can see your face.
Oh, can you not see my face right now?
Yes, I see you on the side a little bit, but can we unshare?
Oh, okay, yeah, let me see. How do I do that?
I think you go to share screen and you unshare it, or maybe you go to view options and keep.
Oh, there we go. Stop share.
Oh, yes.
There's my big face.
Yes, yeah, good to see you. So,
Likewise.
all right. So in terms of working with the TPA, I know some of our employers are probably not familiar with that. So we have been actually offering some suggestions and referrals, and we do help our employers with that. So the moral of the story is that if you do need anything from learning from today's webinar, you can definitely contact us and we can definitely give you the right direction. So, all right, and let's see if we have any other questions in here. We have a thank you from Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
and
Sarah.
Yes, so let's, without further ado, let's go to the next portion of our event. And thank you so much, Paul, for your class today. And if you're looking for a CE credit, please email or call us within the next 24 hours. 如果你需要 CE 学分的话，请在24小时之内发电子邮件或致电给我们 info@epiagroup.com or call us at 1-626-912-1988. Thank you so much, Robert, and hope to see you soon. Okay, thank you. So right now we're going to go into our raffle draw portion, and you have to be online to receive the prizes. So please, if you accidentally got locked out or your friends were on here, please remind them to come back on so we can continue with the raffle drawing. All right, so we will draw our first winner. Our prizes today are $20 gift cards. We have 3 winners, so let's start. Victor Young, Victor, thank you so much. Congratulations, Victor. And we will contact you based on the email address you provided. And congratulations, and you know, I hopefully you learned a lot today as well. So our second winner, please. Our second winner is Steve Quo. Steve, thank you so much for attending our event. Steve is a prominent community leader, so thank you, Steve, for being online with us today. Wei Huang, thank you, Wei Huang, for being online with us and really appreciate your attendance. Okay. All right, thank you, everybody. And we have more slides to be shown. Okay, so please take out your phones. If you have your computer screen, take out your phones. Scan this QR code and leave us a review. So when I say rate us, when you scan this, you're going to be taken to our Yelp page. So our Yelp page, Yelp usually operates if you do you have to rate us with a star. So you have to rate us and then leave a review, and that's how they will present your review. So 麻烦今天在座的各位呢，请你用你的电话、手机来扫一下这个 QR code， 你就可以到 Yelp 上面留个 review 给我们。那 Yelp 通常呢，它是需要你先打这个星哈，你打我们希望今天的这个活动是个5颗星，那5颗星再留下评论 ，Yelp 才会把这个review 送出来present 出来。所以非常感谢你们的参与。So next page, please. So we will send a follow-up email to all the attendees, a copy of the PPT and the class recording, and also our handout for 2021 COVID-19 supplemental paid sick leave. 我们会送非常多丰富的奖品哈，这尤其是对公司行号非常的有用的讲义以及课程的录音。那next page. 好，那在我们下课之前呢，我跟大家报告一下哈，我们今天在我们年底的时候呢，会有非常多的open enrollment， 所以在 open enrollment 的时候，大家注意，我们就是专门是为雇主们服务的。如果今天有同的一些专业人士的话，如果你今天对任何保险方面的问题，都欢迎跟我们联络。So at the end of the year for the third and fourth quarter, we have a lot of insurance open enrollments. So there are going to be a lot of questions due to our pandemic last year with all the changes in COBRA. So I welcome everybody to approach us with any questions and any, such as COBRA or, FSA, HRA, all these different plans. So we can definitely help you at the time of open enrollment for all your employees, yourself, or even your customers. So you're welcome to scan our QR code. The first one is our website, second one is Facebook, and the third one is our YouTube to view a review of today's event. So thank you so much, and hope to see you next time.